As the Sega Saturn turns 30, I'm going to be making a short series of videos about why this console is still as awesome as ever, starting off with this USB-C power supply from Robot Retro. So it is hard to believe, isn't it, that it is 30 years since the Sega Saturn has come out, and to many people it is the absolute pinnacle of 2D gaming hardware. The problem is it arrived just at the point when everybody wanted 3D, and it managed 3D pretty well. But for me, it's more about the 2D games, the scrolling shooters, the fighters. They just work so well on it. Anyway, this technology is now 30 years old, and there is a chance that some parts at this point might start to fail. One key one of those being the power supply, and now there are more modern options to power your console, just like the one I recently fitted on my Sega Dreamcast console that is powered by a USB-C input. So Robot Retro, the maker of that Dreamcast power supply, has followed up that project with a similar unit for the Sega Saturn. They sent one to me for trying out, and in this video I'll be showing you how I got on. Okay, so first of all, if you want to know more about this, go and have a look at the Robot Retro website. There is lots of information on there about it, and also information that will help you make the decision as to whether it is right for you or not, and whether it's going to be compatible with your console. So the main thing to know before buying this power supply unit is that it only works on certain models. In fact, it works on most models, provided you don't have the original VA0 model with the Type A power supply. Before opening up your console, you need to know what version you've got. So thankfully, you can tell what version you've got without having to open the console. All you have to do is look on the back and take a note of the serial number that's on the reverse. So I found out mine is a VA9 console with a Type C PSU. I can tell that because AD is the manufacturer code, 6 means it was made in 1996, 9 means that it's a VA9 board, and then it's followed by the unit number 103064. So in short, what that meant for me is that this power supply will work on my console. So in terms of power, the original power supply has a figure 8 cable plugged into it, and quite neatly the actual plug itself was branded with the Sega Saturn logo molded into it. Now, first things first, my Sega Saturn has actually been in storage for a little while, so before I went with any of this installation, I had to test if it was still all working okay. So plugging the original power cable into the back and into the wall, switching on, it still works, and also when I hooked it up to the TV, the video signal, everything else was still working fine. So I was good to go ahead, and I would definitely recommend, if you haven't used any of these consoles in a while and you're doing any mods like this, always test them out first. It just helps later when it comes to any troubleshooting that might be needed. You might also notice that my Sega Saturn has already got a few mods. Yes, I've been into modding for a while, and there's a few mods on my Saturn console that I did years and years ago. You'll notice when I switch on that there is a blue power LED. It's quite nicely diffused without any glare, and I think it looks really nice on that console. It matches the branding of the Sega Saturn as well. And also there's a fairly ugly looking toggle switch on the front, which is because this is a PAL unit, so it outputs a 50 Hz signal as standard. This switch at the front just swaps between 50 and 60 Hz to maximize the display instead of having borders on the top and bottom. So that's quite a useful feature to have. Anyway, before you disassemble the console, just to be on the safe side, once you've removed the power cable, it's worth switching on and leaving it on for a few seconds just to try and discharge any capacitors inside that might be still holding some charge and might pose a risk of electric shock. Once that's done, disengage the switch, flip it upside down and place it on a soft surface. If you look carefully, there will be 5 screws to remove. These are crosshead screws. A Phillips number 2 screwdriver should get those out okay, and just pop those safely to one side. Once that's done, carefully flip it the right way up because it's not held together anymore with the screws, and remove the lid, the top half of the console. You might find that the battery cover from the back just drops out. Just keep an eye on that so you don't lose it. Unlike some other consoles, this top half is not connected in any way. There's no ribbon cables, wires, nothing like that, so you can just pop that to one side until you're ready to put it back together again later. Now, when you look inside my console, you may notice it is slightly unorthodox. It's because I've also installed a mod chip in there years ago, and to power the mod chip there's various wires connected to different points, and also you'll see the wiring from my 50-60 Hz switch. So yours will probably look a lot tidier than mine inside, but the key issue here is if you look at the power supply itself, which is the board that's over on the left, there is a red wire that comes across from the mod chip and is soldered to one of the points that we need to remove the power supply from. So I had to switch on my soldering iron, warm up the end of that wire, and remove it so that I could disengage the power supply. So if you look at the PSU board, there is a grey power cable that's attached with a white plug. You need to squeeze the plug and pull upwards to remove it. The power socket at the rear of the console is held in place with two shorter black screws that will also need removing, again with your crosshead screwdriver. Finally, on the lower right of the power board, as you look at it, there is a silver crosshead screw which you also need to remove. After that, you can carefully lift the original power supply up, most of the work being done at the pins, but also there is a plastic clip to disengage at the side as well. Patience and a bit of wiggling will see it lift free fairly easily. Be careful as you lift it not to touch any of the underside of that power supply board, just in case any of those capacitors still have charge. They could give you a nasty shock if you're not careful. Now in my case, there was still a little bit of solder on one of the pins from where that mod chip wire was attached, so I used some solder wick to clean it up before installing the new power supply. I used Goot Wick as recommended by Natalie the Nerd. It's got flux in it and it does a great job of cleaning up any solder from surfaces where you don't want it. So let's take a look at this new board. It is a beautiful white PCB with a neat layout, clear labels. It's got connectors for Type B and Type C, but there's actually no need to worry about which one to use, as the pins will align as you lay it into the console itself anyway. There's a connector to add in an optional 5-volt fan if you want to do that, and also a switch to swap between 9 and 12 volts depending on the original power supply of your console. Now, on the reverse of the PCB, we've got some labeling which tells us that Type A power supplies VA0 are not compatible. Type B, VA1 to VA5 will need its setting to 9 volts. Type C, NTSC, which is the VA6 onwards, will have either 9 or 12 volts. Either will work. Now, if you've got a Type C PAL VA6, you can check the original or use 9 volts if unsure. Now, mine is a PAL VA9, so I tried 9 volts first. However, when I looked on the back of the power supply, it has actually got a small 12 volt marking on one of the points, so it might be okay with that. I have been testing it and it seems fine with 9 volts, but I have been advised that accuracy is best, so I do intend to disassemble it and do some more testing with a multimeter to see if 12 volts is a better option. So as well as the PSU itself, the kit comes with a 3D printed adapter to house the USB-C port, which is much smaller than the original figure 8 socket. I was supplied with a choice of either a black or white adapter. Now this all depends on the console that it's being put inside. Mine is black, so I went with the black unit. However, there's lots of different colors available, including clear ones if you've got a different color console, or one of the clear aftermarket shells that you can get from AliExpress. The adapter itself aligns neatly with the clean surface facing outwards. It gets screwed in place after the board is in position. When it comes to routing the power cable, I was going to have it coming up at the side like it was on the original power supply, but I actually found it made for a much neater installation to feed the cable all the way towards the back underneath the plastic insulation layer. I installed the new power supply by aligning it first and then carefully applying pressure down onto the metal pins from the motherboard, and they pass through the socket on the power supply itself. I pushed them all the way down and then also made sure the plastic clip was engaged in the notch at the left side of the PSU board. So with the board in place, I took the connector at the end of the power cable, aligned it correctly, pushed it in place, and this time it's parallel to the board instead of being a vertical placement. It's easy to feed any excess wire back down under the power supply board after you've done that. The silver screw that we removed last is first to go in, but this time it's in the lower left in a slightly different position to the original. There is still a screw post in that position, so make sure it's aligned with that hole and then carefully screw it in. Bear in mind you're making a new thread as you go. With the new power supply in place, I used my soldering iron to reattach the power wire for the mod chip. I took the opportunity to replace it with a slightly longer, better quality wire than the one I'd originally installed. A little flux and solder on the end of both the wire and the pin before attaching it made it an easy job to connect the wire. Now, just to be clear, this is all because I had the mod chip already installed. This power supply is a completely solder-free experience. It's only in the unlikely event that you have other modifications in there already that you might need to do a little bit of rearranging of your wiring. Next, it was time to put the 3D printed adapter in. It was a very neat fit, but the holes for the screws are quite small. Now this is good as it provides a really secure fit once in place, but it was quite hard work to get the holes started off. I used the original screws that had held the old power socket in place. Now just be patient and take your time. It suggests on the Robot Retro website that once you get one of the screws engaged, get it about halfway and then start with the other one, as it's easier to get it in position. Then once they're both started off, just nip them all the way up and don't over tighten. It's definitely worth taking your time though, because the absolute last thing you want to do is slip and scratch your precious console with a screwdriver. So take your time, it'll all be good. So once it's all in place, the adapter does protrude very slightly with the USB-C socket nestling just inside. I thought this might be a bit of an issue, but it works absolutely fine with a whole variety of USB-C cables I've tried plugging into the back, so there's no problem with that at all. Okay, so now it comes to putting the lid on. Now make sure you're prepared for this, because if you don't align it correctly, you can cause some damage. So first of all, make sure that the little light pipe at the front that comes up from the power LED is secured in place on the lower half of the shell, and then as you bring the top half over, align that tiny hole with the top part of that light pipe. Basically, if that's in position, then you're checking the power buttons in position. Everything else should just lower in place quite neatly. Have a quick check all the way around the edge to make sure all the seams meet, and then it's time to flip it upside down again and put all of your screws back in. Now bear in mind these are plastic threads inside, so to reinsert the screw without causing any damage, first of all turn your screwdriver anti-clockwise until you feel the screw locate in position, and then screw it all the way tight. Do that with all 5 screws and you are pretty much done. You will also need to clip your battery cover back in place on the reverse of the console, flip it over, and it's time to test it out. So in my case, I was using my power brick. Now bear in mind you need the 15 or 20 volt power supply, and not all power bricks can do that, so you will need specific ones that have that capability if you're planning on running it in a little bit more of a portable fashion. But in the case of this one, of mine, it's capable of doing all the way up to 18, maybe even 20 volts, so that worked absolutely fine. So I plugged it in at the reverse of the console, pressed the button, and thankfully the power LED came on and the disk drive whirred into action, so it was working fine. In terms of powering on, I have since connected it up to my TV, and again it runs everything absolutely fine. So yeah, it was an easy job despite my kind of mod chip causing me a few issues. If you were thinking of upgrading your power supply, I think in particular if you've got a NTSC console and you're living in the UK, this is a really convenient way to power it. Also, if you've got an older console that is no longer working because there's an issue with the power supply, this is a really straightforward replacement. Or if you're just curious like me and you want to try out something new and you wanted to do a different way of doing things, then you can't leave things alone, then it's a good option for you as well. It's available on Robot Retro's website for £40. If you're interested, I will leave a link in the description. Go and check that out, and there's more information about it on the website too. I'll also link that other website I was talking about, which will tell you if it's going to be compatible with your console or not. So thanks for watching. As I mentioned, I have got more Saturn videos to come soon, so keep an eye out for those. I did mention earlier that this isn't the first of these power supplies I've tried out. I've got a USB-C power supply that I am absolutely loving in my Sega Dreamcast console. If you want to find out a bit more about that, I will link the video for it up here. Otherwise, I will see you in the next video. Take care. Bye.